Going from a slave to a free person was not something that was as easy as one might expect. This was a new life for them, and everyone in the society knew it. Now, the moment freedom was declared in the South, there was a wide range of reactions from both the master and the slave. Some as expected, some sneaky, and some which made no sense at all. And so let's take a look at these accounts in Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Here we go.
The number of slaves who waited for the master to confirm their freedom, rather than assert it independently, is not altogether surprising.
This was after the Civil War had ended, the Confederates lost to the Union, and slavery had been abolished. Afterwards, a number of slaves waited for freedom to be announced by their masters.
Whether the enslaved worker had labored on a plantation or a farm, he had been brought up to view his master as the primary source of authority, the provider and the protector, the lawmaker and the enforcer, the judge and the jury, and most masters had deliberately cultivated feelings of dependency and helplessness in their slaves. No edict of emancipation could immediately obliterate the habits of obedience and deference with which many slaves had been inculcated since childhood.
No amount of telling them how free they were could immediately undo all the ideas and habits of dependency they had been forced to develop since childhood. And from a broader view, nearly 250 years of forced indoctrination to be a slave. And nothing could immediately change this at that point.
Nor could it in some instances destroy a familiar relationship worked out over a period of time, involving mutual obligations of service, sustenance, and protection. The defeat of the Confederacy and the abolition of slavery no doubt weakened the master's stature in the eyes of many slaves, but it did not necessarily lessen the respect, fear, and obedience he commanded by virtue of his authority and economic power.
They looked at their masters as the supreme authority over them, which from a certain perspective they really were. And one of the ways they were able to do this was by keeping them ignorant and doing this.
A lot of the niggas know nothing except what Mrs. and Master told us,
a former Georgia slave observed.
What they said was just the same as the Lord had spoken to us.
Remember, we talked about this before. That's how they used the tool of the Bible to make slaves. And this former slave is letting us know, right? The doctrine was that the whites' interpretation of the Christian God had set them up to rule over those they called black people. And the slaves, being religiously ignorant, were taught that whatever the whites said was the same as if the Lord had spoken it to them.
And in this instance, he told them that Lincoln was dead, they were still slaves, and he would distribute black cloth so they could mourn both Lincoln and their freedom.
So he manipulated them and had them celebrate the death of Lincoln and the death of their freedom by distributing black cloth so they could mourn. And why the color black? Because in Western culture, it's used to symbolize death, right? Which is why it's worn at funerals. Think about it, and let's continue.
Although the time and manner varied from place to place, the majority of masters eventually got around to informing their slaves that emancipation had become the law of the land. Occasionally, they did so under the compulsion of a federal order, upon the visitation of a Freedmen's Bureau officer, or at the demand of their own slaves. Usually, the master himself decided how and when to make the announcement. When he sent out the word for his slaves to assemble the next day, nearly everyone knew what to expect.
There was little, if any, sleep that night.
Booker T. Washington recalled.
All was excitement and expectancy.
Except perhaps for the coming of the Yankees, it was like no other day in their lives. Outside the big house, the master waited for them on the front porch, often with his entire family standing beside him. To the very end, he would invariably act the role of the patrician, even as he presided over the dispersion of his flock and the sundering of traditional and even intimate ties. Observing how their master
couldn't help but cry,
or
couldn't hardly talk.
Some former slaves confessed to having felt a certain compassion for him at this moment, putting the best possible face on his previous treatment of them.
We couldn't help thinking about what a good master he always had been.
A former Georgia slave recalled.
And how old and feeble and gray-headed he looked as he kept on a-talking that day.
Some slaves felt bad for their old masters, some because they genuinely cared for them, and others because they were not used to seeing them on the other side of the struggle.
Such sentiments were not shared by all slaves, not even on the same plantation, and each black had a different way of recollecting a master's or mistress's tears at the moment of emancipation.
Missy, she cries and tells us we is free.
A former Louisiana slave recalled,
And she hopes we starve to death, and she'd be glad, 'cause it ruined her to lose us.
Her entire world was finished. It made her angry to know that her former property that afforded her a certain lifestyle was no longer forced to do so.
if slaveholders felt morally reprehensible or guilt-ridden, they evinced no indication of it at the moment they declared their blacks to be free. Nothing in the post-war behavior and attitudes of these people suggested that the ownership of slaves had necessarily compromised their values or tortured their consciences. Nor was there any reason to suspect hypocrisy or self-deception in the
strong conviction
of Henry W. Ravenel, for example,
that the old relation of master and slave had received the divine sanction and was the best condition in which the two races could live together for mutual benefit.
He was thoroughly convinced that God set it up for whites to rule over blacks, and that system was the best way for both of them to be mutually beneficial to one another. And how? Because the idea was that blacks were naturally chaotic, disorderly, and intellectually inferior, and the whites were the opposite. And since blacks were seen as being incapable of civilizing themselves, God put them into the hands of the whites to do it for them, right? And in return, the whites would get the free labor. So the blacks get Christianity, order, and civilization, and the whites get laborers, wealth, and rulership, right? That's why he said it was a mutual benefit.
Any detectable twinges of conscience in the slaveholding class largely stemmed from the realization that some had abused the institution. But like any northern employer, the master maintained that the excesses of the few should not be permitted to question or undermine the system itself. Nor were most of them intent on foisting the responsibility for bondage on the New Englanders, who had initially supplied them. After all, a New Orleans newspaper observed several years after the war, the transplantation from Africa to North America had humanized the Negro, regenerating him in body, mind, and morals. Rather than confess any misgivings about their slave-holding past, most masters at this moment viewed themselves as decent men, good Christians who had performed a useful, necessary, and benevolent task, fulfilling an obligation to an inferior people which more than compensated for the labor they had received in return.
That's why no reparations were given to them after slavery. They didn't see themselves as having done something wrong. And in fact, it was looked at as doing them a favor.
There was nothing for which they needed to apologize. As George A. Trenholm proudly told the Chamber of Commerce of Augusta, Georgia, in early 1866,
"Sir, we have educated them. We took them barbarians. We returned them Christianized and civilized to those from whom we received them. We paid for them. We returned them without compensation. Our consciences are clear. Our hands are clean."
How many people know this history and this line of thought? A lot of people, especially those who have a more influential role in guiding America. They've read all this material and they know the history. And when they run across these ideas, they seriously consider the validity of the argument. And many people agree with it in secret, but they'll never voice that opinion in public, right? They'll never do that. And many people wonder why reparations have never been handed out, and it's because they don't know the history of the argument. And the fact that reparations was not given to the former slaves or their descendants, it tells us that a lot of people in position agree with this point of view, right? And you know this by looking at the actions. But the reality is the only reparations people should be looking forward to today and going forward is the one that they can give themselves, which is repairing their consciousness, character, and culture, which a $100,000 check can never do.
Albert Hill, who had been a slave in Georgia, recalled how his master tried to explain to them on this day the difference between freedom,
hustling for ourselves,
and slavery,
depending on someone else.
Even as the master stressed the problems his slaves were liable to confront as freedmen and freedwomen, he seldom suggested, at least not in their presence, that he may have been negligent in preparing them to assume the responsibilities of freedom,
which would have been to help fix their minds. But that's not what happened. They got cast into the free world with the slave mentality, and they were never really told the full extent on what happened to them and how they got the way they did.
Rather, he reminded his blacks how he had raised them to be honest, to work diligently, and to lead moral and Christian lives. But at the same time, and without perceiving any contradiction, he usually urged them to remain on the plantation until, as one former slave recalled,
they get the foothold and learn how to do.
That is, until they learned how to take care of themselves.
Some genuinely meant this, but others used this as a sneaky approach to keep laborers on the plantation.
The least any gentleman planter could do at this time was to invite his people to stay with him and continue to share in the comforts, sustenance, and protection the old home supposedly afforded them. He acted, in other words, to preserve his source of labor in the guise of protecting his former slaves from the inevitable hardships and snares of freedom.
You see that?
Claiming a responsibility toward them as dependents, which emancipation should in no way compromise, some masters tried to ease the burden of freedom on the older slaves and the children.
Old Amelia and her 2 grandchildren,
Henry W. Ravenel wrote,
I will spare the mockery of offering freedom to. I must support them as long as I have anything to give.
whether from a sense of paternal obligation or to exploit their labor, some masters insisted that the children remain with them until they reached the age of 21, and the apprenticeship laws usually permitted them to do so if the parents were missing or unable to support the children. Silas Dothram, a former Arkansas slave who could not recall ever seeing his parents, was about 10 years old when freedom came.
They kept me in bondage and a girl that used to be with them. We were bound to them that we would have to stay with them. They kept me just the same as under bondage. I wasn't allowed no kind of say-so.
And this does depend on how you look at it. Would it be right to let a 10-year-old boy with no parents just go off into freedom, or should they have kept him under their control? Right? This one is not so absolute.
On the night of the announcement, Murda Avery recalled, the slaves assembled in the backyard, many of them holding pine torches. On the porch of the big house stood her father, next to a table on which a candle had been placed, looking out at a
sea of uplifted black faces.
All of them now fastened on him. The planter first read from a formal document, presumably the Emancipation Proclamation, after which he spoke to them in a trembling voice.
Observe.
You do not belong to me anymore. You are free. You have been like my own children. I have never felt that you were slaves. I have felt that you were charges put into my hands by God, and that I had to render account to him of how I raised you, how I treated you. I want you all to do well. You will have to work, if not for me, for somebody else. Heretofore, you have worked for me, and I have supported you, fed you, clothed you, given you comfortable homes, paid your doctor's bills, bought your medicines, taken care of your babies before they could take care of themselves. When you were sick, your mistress and I have nursed you. We have laid your dead away. I don't think anybody else can have the same feeling for you that she and I have. I've been trying to think out a plan for paying wages or a part of the crop that would suit us all, but I haven't finished thinking it out. I want to know what you think. Now you can stay just as you have been staying and work just as you have been working, and we will plan together what is best, or you can go. My crops must be worked, and I want to know what arrangements to make. Ben, Dick, Moses, Abram, line up everybody out there. As you pass this porch, tell me if you mean to stay. You needn't promise for longer than this year, you know. If you want to go somewhere else, say so and no hard thoughts.
After their master completed his talk, the blacks who had
listened silently
passed before him, each one of them indicating that he intended to remain.
They all wanted to stay behind. That's the Negro consciousness kicking in.
Uncle Andrew, the black patriarch on this plantation, no doubt spoke the sentiments of most of them when he explained his decision.
Law, master, they ain't got nowhere to go if I was gwine.
He didn't want to face the unknown. Now, there is a chance that he really didn't want to stay just for the sake of staying, and that he just didn't have faith in any of his ability to make it in the free world. And on the other hand, maybe his plantation life wasn't so bad, right? At least it wasn't bad enough to make freedom desirable enough for him to care about it, right? Who knows?
The next morning, the freedmen went about their regular duties, except for Uncle F, who was nowhere to be found.
He took off. But
several days later, he returned, a disillusioned man, and
the butt of the quarters for many a day.
he returned to the plantation, and the other Negroes made fun of him for even attempting to try freedom.
On this Virginia plantation, the transition from slavery to freedom had been completed. It was the perfect picture, embodying the notions of white nobility, black humility, mutual obligations, faithful service, and the extended family unit, black and white. The slaves had reacted precisely as any grateful and properly trained people would have been expected to react. And Uncle F had discovered for all of them the advantages of the old home compared to the uncertainty and insecurity that lay outside.
I just want to see what it feel like to be free,
he explained after his brief sojourn.
And I wanted to go back to old Master's plantation where I was born. It don't look the same, dawg, and I done see enough of freedom.
That freedom didn't look too good for him. He went, tested it out, and he realized, hey, this is not for me, right? That's just the way it goes. Everything is not for everybody. And as soon as we realize that, then things become way smoother, life makes more sense, and we can focus on being around the people who care about the things that we do, because everybody doesn't, right? That's the reality. And with that, we continue to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.